For nearly 30 years did fans of Disney's Tron await its sequel, before Tron Legacy finally arrived in 2010. Launching alongside it was Tron Evolution, a tie-in video game and companion piece to the movie. It served as a prequel to Legacy and expanded upon events referenced in the film. During that vast gulf of time between the two movies, Disney went through various non-starters, abandoned ideas and unsuccessful pitches to kickstart the franchise. It took up until around 2008 for them to find a new direction for the series. Tron was coming back, and in no small way, Disney was plotting a massive multimedia approach to relaunch Tron for a new generation. Included among this were talks of a new video game. Behind the scenes, Disney had put out the word to a handful of game development studios in around September 2008. For these select companies, they would now have the opportunity to submit proposals to them, sharing their ideas for potential games. If successful, their project would receive Disney's financing and aim for a release around the time of the film. For several development houses around the world, the gears were now starting to turn as they took to the challenge of playing a role in Tron's big revival. Only one of them would come out on top to partner with Disney, the other ideas and pitches would fall into obscurity. Among the various companies involved was Day One Studios in Chicago. At the time, Day One found itself embroiled in something of a difficult situation. They were wrapping up on another game, Fracture, which was a new IP made in collaboration with Lucasarts. Unfortunately for them, Fracture had been subject to a rocky development cycle. Some of the developers I spoke to cited friction between them and LucasArts as one of its key difficulties. They felt that creative control of the project had been restricted by the publisher. Partway through development, they were instructed to change it from a first-person shooter to a third-person one, resulting in an onslaught of technical problems. The founder of LucasArts, filmmaker George Lucas, is known to have stepped in multiple times to enforce some of these unwanted changes upon staff. For instance, he insisted upon changing the name of the protagonist midway through development to Jet Brody, despite the fact that their marketing had already named the character as Mason Briggs. It was after the game was shipped, however, that the future of Day One was thrown into uncertainty. Fracture sold poorly, and this led to LucasArts subsequently cutting ties with them. Where they would go next was now completely up in the air, as their management attempted to make deals with various big companies such as Marvel, Warner Brothers, and Disney in search of their next contract. Were they unsuccessful in securing more work, jobs would soon be at risk. In their efforts to pitch for the Tron sequel game, Day One Studios started to gradually assemble an experimental prototype as a proof of concept to present to Disney's executives. The circumstances under which this prototype was developed were somewhat unconventional. In what was fairly unusual for a process like this, Disney initially neglected to provide the team's artists with material from the new movie to inform the visual design of their prototype. In other words, they had no clear idea of what it would look like. The artists therefore decided that they would craft the game's look by referencing the first movie, and strictly that alone. A few months prior to the start of development, in July 2008, Disney had attended San Diego Comic-Con, where the first announcement of a Tron sequel movie was made. Test footage for the film was shown exclusively to fans in attendance, revealing its working title, Tron 2, stylized as TR2N. The clip established a new frontier for the franchise with a refreshed visual design for the 21st century and a preview of the story to come. Despite this reveal and camera footage of the teaser inevitably making its way online, the artists at Day One had steered clear of it. They wanted to reimagine Tron for the modern day themselves from scratch. It would offer them a chance to show Disney their ability and understanding of the license from an artistic perspective. It was almost by coincidence that the artists landed on a style that was actually very close to what Disney's Tron Legacy ended up looking like. The costumes were primarily black, mixed with a tinge of bright neon. Their ideas for the darker appearance of the grid, as well as the new light bikes and identity discs, were very similar too. The only considerable distinction between the two separate visions of Tron 2 was that white light suits were slightly more common in the concept art made by Day One. This was an intentional visual reference towards the costumes worn in the original movie, which they tried to adhere to closely. In Disney's Tron Legacy, the only white light suits are worn by civilians and not by warrior programs like the ones seen in Day One's illustrations. Although some of Day One's artists ignored the aforementioned Comic-Con footage when designing their assets, other members of the team did not. In fact, another group of developers even went about directly recreating some of what was seen in the clip within the game's prototype. Initial pre-production, mainly involving concept art, lasted up until the end of 2008. After the holiday period, Day One's workers returned to the offices in January 2009 2009, and core development on their prototype finally commenced. The TRON team, a fairly small group, was divided in two to create separate components of the prototype. One worked on mechanics for the light bike and identity discs, the other was tasked with coming up with a brand new vehicle. The meat of the demo essentially ended up taking what was seen in the clip from Comic-Con, an aggressive light bike chase between two programs, and translating that into a playable video game. The prototype was split into a few main parts. The first was a single-player open-world environment, another was a multiplayer mode accessible locally via split screen. The single-player section of the demo allowed players to explore a reasonably large city area inside the grid, controlling an unnamed program. The player had a couple of options at their fingertips. They could use their disc to perform target practice against a few destructible objects like pillars, or they could ride around on their light bike. Wandering the grid would draw the attention of hostile programs, leading to battles. Players could either attack them using their identity disc, or attempt to de-res them with their light bike. If you tried to flee from the enemy AI with your vehicle, they would equip theirs and begin pursuing you. Where Day 1's TRON 2 differed from the other pitches that Disney was presented with was that it would have given players the ability to instantly switch between on-foot movement and speeding off using a light bike at almost any time. This forms a complete contrast with the TRON sequel game that was released, TRON Evolution by Propaganda Games, in which the bikes can only be used during fixed set pieces when the story demands it. The prototype offers us a glimpse at a slightly more open game compared to Evolution, which was very linear in its design. Former developers from Day 1 say that their game too would have been mostly linear, but would have employed a bit more exploration. Some vague ideas for a story were being thrown around during development, which were similar in tone to the original movie. The grid again would have found itself being ruled over by another authoritarian force, in this case Clue. The game would have followed a freedom fighter attempting to liberate the digital world in the years leading up to the second movie. If the way in which Day 1 developers describe it is any indication, the plot would have been very similar to the animated TV show TRON Uprising. The series revolved around the adventures of a rebellious program leading a revolution against Clue and his lieutenants. In keeping with these themes, Day 1's project would ultimately become known as TRON 2 Liberation. One big divergence between Liberation and the game released, TRON Evolution, is how different their respective combat systems were. In Evolution, players fight through hack-and-slash style gameplay, alternating between multiple discs, each with their own unique attributes. One, for instance, can generate explosions. Propaganda Games chose to put a lot of emphasis on these powers and steadily whittling down enemy health bars with large, powerful blows. Liberation, on the other hand, was attempting an approach that was more true to the identity disc battles seen in the movies. In the prototype, there was a certain element of vulnerability to players and enemies. Each combatant had a relatively small amount of health, meaning they could be easily de-resed if they weren't careful. Players would have to time their attacks well, blocking and evading carefully to survive. In the single-player mode, a successful dodge would cause the action to enter a very brief stylized slow motion effect. The pacing of the fights worked similar to a tennis match according to one designer. If one player hurled a disc and their opponent was quick enough, they could catch it and throw it back even faster. It would steadily get more challenging as things sped up and more discs were added to the equation. There was a degree of subtlety to the controls, enabling you to add spin or curve to your throws, making them trickier for enemies to keep on top of. On the other side of the coin, the multiplayer component of the pitch pitted two players against one another along a racing track with light cycles. This was a deviation from the standard light cycle battle seen in the original movie or the arcade game inspired by it, where competitors would fight in a rectangular arena setting. It was all about trapping your opponents in the trail produced by your bike, which would kill them upon impact. The fundamentals in Day 1's take on the formula were essentially the same. You still had to trick rivals into crashing into your wall of light, except it was a race to the finish now too. The designers added in a jump function, allowing you to leap over your opponent's trail. This could also help you to overcome obstacles or strategically hop over the other player to take them out. Lastly, there was the aforementioned third arm to the pitch, Day 1's original design for a new TRON vehicle. They had come up with a four-wheel racing buggy inspired by the light cycles. One developer likened it to the Light Runner, a vehicle briefly used by Cora in TRON Legacy. Unfortunately for the developers who worked on this part of the prototype, it didn't make it very far. The majority of them agreed that it simply wasn't nearly as fun as the light bikes, which ended up becoming a key focal point of the pitch. The majority of work on TRON 2 Liberation concluded after a few months into 2009. Negotiations went back and forth until midway through the year. Day 1 tried to sell Disney on the project, saying they would develop it for Xbox 360 360, PS3, and PC. It was prototyped on Xbox 360 hardware. Disney was also looking for a release on Wii, which likely would have happened via a separate studio had it been greenlit, as the team soon discovered it wasn't going to be. Some developers claim that Disney's board were impressed with aspects of their presentation, namely their recreation of the iconic light cycles. This didn't amount to anything more than compliments though. Their decision about whether or not to have the game made is said to have been mostly down to development costs. Propaganda Games, who presented a competing pitch with Tron Evolution, was able to underbid them. It would cost Disney less, and they were confident that they could deliver it for a deadline of late 2010. This was little more than a year away at that point, a fact that caused trepidation among Day One staff members. Many were of the opinion that having such a constrained timeline would negatively impact development, resulting in a poor final product. One developer had this to say: "In the end, it was too fast for us to reasonably do, and I think the quality of the game that actually came out shows this." Tron Evolution was developed by Propaganda Games in just less than a year and received mixed reviews from critics. Once their Tron game was no more, Day One's financial instability caught up with them. Around 10 to 15 staffers were laid off as they failed to gain a new contract. The company would eventually recover, however, working on Fear 3 and later being acquired by Wargaming in 2013. If you've enjoyed this video, please don't forget to subscribe and check out my other videos for more exclusive looks at lost video games. Hit the annotations to check out my previous video on 6 games from various big companies that never happened, or you can discover some previously unseen, unreleased Star Wars games. Unseen64 is an archive for cancelled, unreleased, and unseen video games. You can visit the site at unseen64.net. I've been Liam, I hope this video has been of interest, and have fun.